Northeast Louisiana and someone from the Acadiana region. And in that order, I'd like to present Pat Whitty, who is serving instead for Don Pearson, our Secretary of Louisiana Economic Development, who's in an airport right now in New Orleans, who was hopeful of being here. But Pat is going to pinch hit as he works in that department. I had the pleasure of hiring Don and Pat when I was Secretary of Economic Development. Don was my Assistant Secretary. Pat was handling community development, and so they are both still in that department, so they've got a lot of years of experience. Pat especially is involved in working with our disaster recovery process as we go with business recovery, so we're pleased to have him with us today. Also, in your packet you'll see there's a little bio of each of the people, so I'm not reading all of their information for you. You will see a photograph of Greg Gautreaux. Now you'll notice Greg graduated from LSU, and he started his career in 1980. Well, this is his picture from 1980. So, I've known Greg a long time. He's done a wonderful job here at the Lafayette Economic Development Authority. And can you imagine, this organization was once called the Lafayette Harbor Terminal and Industrial Development District. Now, how would you like to answer that telephone? So they changed the name to LEDA, which is a whole lot easier. But they are the economic development agency for Lafayette, one of the leading economic development agencies in the state of Louisiana, and Greg is here to share some of their experiences in terms of recovery. And Scotty Robinson is the president of the Ouachita Parish Police Jury. Now, Scotty is, at the age of 31, the president of the Ouachita Parish Police Jury. Started his career at the age of 26, public service at 26. He's very involved. His dad has been a long-term member of the school board in Ouachita Parish, so it runs in the family. His wife is a school teacher, and he's going to address some of the issues that occurred in North Louisiana and beyond, because his agency, the police jury, is going to be directly responsible for some of the infrastructure that has to be fixed in that part of our state. So, as we move forward, I want to remember that there are a lot of people that it took to put this thing on. And Monique, I don't see you here, but thanks very much for all of the work you did. She made first contact with me and said, would you do this? If you don't, I'll release some photographs of you. And so then Tanya Pence, David Dodd, Chris Fiducia, all these people work with us. UL President Joe Savoy has been a colleague of mine for a long time and is a member of the Committee of 100, the organization that I service and work for. And so he was here earlier but had to step out. So it was good to see that the governor came to address us, that former Governor Blanco was here as well. So this is an important feature. You will remember that Governor Blanco had to suffer through the vestiges of what in the post-Katrina Rita era we went through a lot in terms of recovery all over our state, particularly in the southern part of the state. So today what we're trying to do is to focus on the economic impact. A lot of people don't talk about the economic impact, but it's something that we have to consider, particularly now that we've learned so many lessons. You know, Louisiana is a very unusual place. Not only do we have an affection for joie de vivre, foods, and all of those other things, Mardi Gras, et cetera, but we have an unusual place. You'll find in that LAR's economic data some very interesting information, by the way. Like Louisiana is fourth in the United States in total bridge area with almost 1,300 bridges. 5 of the 8 longest bridges in the world are in Louisiana. You know, I love those datas, you know, those pieces of data that are very interesting. But also you have to realize on energy, you know, we've got electric utilities. They were talking about pipelines. I noticed that they had almost 30,000 miles of pipelines, oil pipelines, gas pipelines. But do you know that Louisiana is one of the leading states, along with Texas, that's where the bulk of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is, that stores our oil in case of catastrophic events, nuclear attack, whatever might be caused here. That's a very important feature. And all of these things are assets that we've got to consider that are impacted by catastrophic events or any catastrophic event. So there's a lot to be discussed. And by the way, as we are discussing the economic impacts, we're not going to go through this data, But these are some things that I think make a difference. You know, when you talk about the 5,700 unemployment claims, it's pretty interesting to know that we had 5,600 jobs that were affected in the 2016 flood alone, which cost us about $2.3 million in losses a day. So that's what we're going to talk about today, are those other things beyond people's houses, beyond businesses closing. We're going to talk about those other costs that are associated with downtime from catastrophic events. And so our team of people we're going to take some questions from the audience as we move along, but we're going to start off with some questions that have been developed by our team of people. And so, Pat, we're going to pick on you first. And the first question deals with, are we effectively measuring the ripple effects of natural disasters? You know, you got a lot of crop damage, a lot of livestock losses, agricultural processing, transportation, distribution, consumer impact, price increases due to shortages, having to bring food from further away, even the cost of possible temporary food shortages. Let's talk about all of those things that you all are learning at the department relative to the other impacts that we don't see a lot of beyond people's homes and businesses closing.
Well, thank you. I'm glad this information is up behind me, because that really talks about the first level of impact that we normally see, we normally think about in terms of our Department of Economic Development. Those things are critical to us. How many businesses were out of place? I mean, part of what we do is reach out and try to figure out the impact of businesses, physical damage, those type things. How's our infrastructure doing? The lost value and of labor and production. All those things are critical. But as Mr. Olivier pointed to, maybe that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the kind of the things you can see at first glance. The things that we continue to have to think about are all critical in the work that we do in economic development. Greg will tell you quickly that our business is about selling a state, or selling a product, or selling a site, or selling a community, and we can't run from disasters. We can't hide from that. It is part of our life here in Louisiana. So we have to find a way to calculate or to talk intelligently about what a company who wants to invest possibly in our state, what they can do to mitigate the cost associated with. But the things that I think about, in addition to, again, the information behind me, is the loss of essential services. We talked about this as soon as the March and August floods happened. We started to try to figure out, when could business reopen? Well, maybe not a majority, but there were a number of businesses who wanted to reopen quickly. They had the monies to do so. They had the personnel to do so. They had the product to do so, but there were no rooftops because folks were flooded out. They had no customer base. We have to always be cognizant of those kinds of things. Schools closing, students displaced, businesses frozen, even if they could reopen. As I mentioned, there were no customers. Loss of community services, churches impacted, community organizations who provide social services impacted, tourist dollars, and the one that I've surely heard a great deal about is what I call the train hit the wall, meaning as long as the train's running on time and things are moving along nicely, everybody seems to be okay. But you know, if you take a small rural community and the majority of the homes are flooded, the small number of businesses that are there are flooded or impacted, that also impacts the local government. They almost have to consider how they're going to run things, how they're going to manage with such a short cash flow. Loss of tourist dollars, and again, I talk in terms of the forgotten ones, the folks who have to have special needs care, the folks that have to have special medical care. All of that gets amplified and gets exacerbated in the middle of a disaster, and that all impacts our economy, and that all impacts our ability at the Department of Economic Development to sell a product. We have to talk about the cost. What is the cost of a disaster?
Very good. Thank you. Greg Gotro, you know, we talk about the impacts of disruption on commercial transportation, the distribution infrastructure. Just moments ago, Pat was mentioning reduced tourism, which is, you know, closing parks and recreation facilities and things that attract tourists as a result of catastrophic event, be it a flood or whatever. And so here in the Acadiana area, what was it that you saw as the impacts over the course of this last year, just as a result of these floods?
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here and see so many good friends from my years all over the state in economic development. You know, the uniqueness of this tragedy is comes through when you look at the numbers. And so I love to give speeches all year long about our economy, and I love to look at the numbers. And I think there's a tale of two communities or two community reactions. The first is immediately after the flood, during and immediately after the flood, and then later. And I'm going to borrow Monique Boulet's phrase and say that, you know, this was a real wake-up call for Lafayette, the community, the parish of Lafayette, that had never had a major water event really affect us like this before. We were sort of immune because we'd never had hurricane strength winds come into this parish. And so really we reacted, I think, in the proper way, but it was certainly the aftermath of Katrina and Rita didn't prepare us, right? It didn't prepare us for what was going to happen, because it happened to us this time. So let's just talk about transportation. I just moved back here from a little town called Church Point. There's a very, very large distribution company. That town, at a certain point during these floods, you couldn't get in or out anywhere from that town. And I thought about it, having gone through a couple of previous storms like we've gone through a lot in these last several years, and it really worried me. If we had, I have two teenagers, you know, if you needed to get them to care or something happened, how would you get them out of these towns? And so I see people in small towns that are not going to be supported the way we can help each other in the bigger city. And I worry about the isolation. I worry about them getting trapped in these relatively high places surrounded by the lower places, right? That's where you build, on high ground. But you got to go through the other ground to get to safety, or to get to amenities, or to get to medical care. And that makes it a very dangerous scenario. Tourism obviously was affected. And prospects. I'm an economic developer. And, you know, I have been through it before when we lost a major prospect after Hurricane Katrina, even though we weren't directly affected. And that major prospect went to Dallas instead. And they were shut down for 3 days by an ice storm a year later in Dallas. So they probably wouldn't have gone there if they had thought about ice storms. But when you have these kinds of events that make national news, you lose prospects. You lose job opportunities. You lose tourists. And the effect is much more far-reaching than people can imagine. And frankly, I haven't seen any numbers that really can reflect that at this point in time. You know, missed opportunity. How do you reflect missed opportunity in a number when you never got the call? You know, the only reason I can tell you about the previous one was because we were in the middle of the process during that time. And so while it happened, our tourism board said, come visit most of the community, most of the areas in business. We tried to deliver the message. But if you look at the Vermilion watershed, according to your numbers, we have $80 million a day in GDP. You just look at transportation and arts and entertainment, you look at approximately 20,000 people in arts and entertainment, including hotels and motels and accommodations, and 7,000 people. That's about a quarter of the workforce represented just in those two industries that in essence were out of business for a significant period of time. And many of the transportation companies and other companies that were out of business weren't out of business because, and manufacturers people we own 4 business parks. The workers couldn't get there. We called the top 50 businesses in the area and said, well, we're open, we weren't affected, but we can't get our people here, and we understand. We're not asking them to come. They have to take care of their family and figure out where they're going to spend the night tonight, and tomorrow night, and the next night. And so, while it's not very articulated very well in numbers, it is certainly anecdotally understood, I hope, by everyone involved, that the impact is tremendous. Let me take just a moment to look at the better side. And this does not count for people that suffer the extreme long-term effects. And I see some friends here from Iberia and from Vermilion, and how many people move away because of Katrina and these floods? How do you show that? So I'm not even going to try to address that until we got years behind us, because I look back at Katrina Rita information in preparation for this information, and it takes years to figure out how it affected migration patterns of these kinds of disasters. But I will say that there's a rebound effect, and the reporters called me probably 3 days after the floods and said, well, when do you expect all the building materials to start paying off and get it? Well, it took till about January. And then in January, we had a significant growth in sales tax collections from building materials. Started in January, and we have something called the EPI. I'm not going to pretend that you can see it online. It's the Economic Performance Index, and that index grew by 8 points in the first quarter of this year. So people around here are resilient. They are building back up. They are buying local. We know that many thousands have received FEMA assistance, many thousands, just 2,500 houses are being rebuilt just in the immediate area of here, not counting our neighboring parishes and some of the harder hit areas. And we know that does have, we've lost 24,000 jobs because of energy since June of 2014. And so, believe it or not, there's a little bit of a silver lining when you see people able to make a few extra dollars because they're working construction, because everybody knows a person from the oil industry can do anything. And so they're out there roofing and working construction and building cabinets, and they are in this, sort of underemployed community and they're helping out. So it does bring a little silver lining. And I didn't want to leave that out because I'm the community cheerleader.
Well done. As an economic developer, you should be. Scotty, as an elected official in North Louisiana, you've got to deal with all of this. So what do you tell us? How do we expect to influence government and private sector to invest in resiliency measures? What's your advice to us?
Well, I can tell you exactly what we are doing in Ouachita Parish. In late 2015, we decided to put a tax measure on the ballot for April of 2016. We flooded in March, just for clarification here, for timeline. And we drew 2 economic development districts, one on the west side of our parish and one on the east side. And on the west side, we said, if this tax passes, it's a sales tax, it will be for roads only, because that's one of the main problems. Phone calls I get are roads on the west side of the parish. On the east side, if this tax will pass, it'll go towards roads and drainage. We have just millions of dollars worth of drainage work that needs to be done. The east side is way more prone to flooding. Even without a flood event, with a big rain event, they flood. So everything goes through bond commission, it gets approved, it's going on the ballot for April 9th, and about a month before, we flood. So, and any of y'all who went through the flood know 30 days later, it's still not better. The parish, people are still displaced from homes, but it's too late. It's on the ballot. People have to go vote. Our west side tax that was for roads only passed by 16 votes. That was good news. The west side of the river, and that's actually, I'm police jury president, but my actual district is on the west side of the river. And that was good news. We were affected by the flood, but not nearly as bad as the east side. That same day, the people who did get out to vote, who were home, who could vote, voted to decline the tax on the east side. So people actively got out and said, we're going to vote no against the tax that will go to roads and drainage. That will directly affect how drainage work is done, what drainage work can be done to help us not flood like this again within reason. You know, when you get that much rain, some people are going to flood. So kind of a long intro there, but I think on the police jury side, we needed to do a better job of explaining to the people of the parish, the businesses of the parish, we need this tax, and here's why. Here's what we're going to do with it. If a major flood event does come, we have all these drainage problems and issues and canals that need to be worked on. Anyway, we just didn't get I don't think we got our word out effectively enough, in my opinion. And then we also got hit by a major flood that flooded everybody. So it was extremely disheartening for people who were standing there, you know, in their flooded home saying, I'm not voting for that tax that will help this not happen again. And it's because I don't think we got out enough to really get the information out like we needed to. As soon as it was over, police jury kind of went back to the drawing board and said, let's put this tax back on there, but let's do a better job. And so here comes the answer to your question. How can we engage the public and private sector? That's what we've been doing. I've got emails, 10 of them going back and forth from today. We are getting with local business leaders, local civic groups. When we're talking to them, we're informing them and explaining to them, this is what the money's for. If this sales tax will pass on the east side of the river, and it will generate around $3 million a year just on the east side, and that can be used for small drainage projects or most likely match money for these much larger drainage projects that are needed. Our engineer put together a list. We said, put together a list of the drainage work that's needed in Ouachita Parish. And this is not a complete list, but this was the first big amount, and it was $90 million worth of drainage work that needs to be done. And this is just in Ouachita Parish. So we do have some major issues. And as the police jury, our local mayors, you know, we all need to get together and really inform the public more on what we need and where it's going, and just see it. And that's kind of what we're hoping. Since the west side tax did pass, we're doing roads, we're building new asphalt, redoing roads, overlaying roads, and this time we're being able to go to the east side and say, listen, we know you voted no last time, but if you'll vote yes, this is what we can do. We can do your roads, we can do your drainage, you know, look to the future, prepare if something like this happens again. So I think a little bit more government, public engagement is kind of the answer, at least for us in Ouachita Parish.
More and better communication.
Yes.
We can't just leave it to government. We've got to get the private sector involved. We've got to get the individual involved so that there are solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, we're reaching the end of our time frame, and we want to leave time for a question. Someone must have a question. If you do, please raise your hand. We'll bring you Pat. Pat Forbes is the director of the Governor's Office of Community Development, has been our fearless leader for the task force called the Restore Louisiana Task Force, and the chairman was here earlier, Jimmy Durbin. They've done a great job, so Pat's probably got a book of questions.
The question that I have, thank you, Michael. Is it on? No?
Turn.
Hello? Okay. The question that I have is one that I get asked all the time, which is how can we do a better job of generating and collecting and disseminating data about economic impact specifically? I mean, we have a lot of data about people, agricultural losses even, but the broader, it's very hard for us to get good information about impacted businesses. How were they impacted? How much? That kind of thing. And I'm wondering, every disaster, it seems the same question lingers for us, and how can we get better data about impact so we can go do a better job of helping?
And Pat, that's an excellent question. As a member of the Governor's Task Force, I can tell you I serve on the subcommittee that deals with the business recovery side, and we are struggling with just that. We know that there's about 25,000 businesses that are impacted, and we're trying to get information to find out, can we give you some help? And we can't, what did you send, 90,000, or you sent many thousands of postcards out, 26,000 postcards out, so we could find out what businesses need help. I mean, I know it's a year later, but there've got to be some businesses that are there that need help. Pat, take a shot at what the department might be doing and what you all are doing from your perspective.
Well, on my fancy notes developed by staff about the last 15 minutes, I wrote down here the Watershed Initiative is a case study in collaboration. So for us, it's an opportunity that is this all? Excuse me. Let me restate that. The Watershed Initiative is a case study in collaboration. For us, it's going to be very important for us. Well, let me go back again. I'll tell you right now, we are remembering what we forgot. I mean, that's kind of the whole story of disasters. So it's going to be up to us. Pat makes a great point, because it's funny, we go to him for information and he's struggling to get information, number of agencies. So it is going to be a study in collaboration. It's going to be a study in making sure we don't protect information, that we share information and we can use it to the benefit of everyone. That has been a struggle. I mean, it is, we talk in estimates, and that's just not good enough.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me thank our panel, and be with us for the next panel on community risk assessment. It's all yours. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you. You can take this. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Olivier, and thank you to the panel. We'll now do a quick change of the panel and come up with panel number 2, which is going to be focused on community risk decisions. I'm going to moderate this one, so I've got a few minutes to just kind of walk you through what this will be about. So this panel coming up is going to be focusing on what are the types of decisions and maybe some of the impacts of those decisions that communities can make for themselves. So there's lots of this effort as we look forward to how do we address flooding and how do we mitigate things in the future. And a lot of times we jump to thinking about projects that need funding and need application and things that may need permitting. And so a lot of this sometimes feels like all of that is in somebody else's hands for somebody else to make a decision about it. And we're at the mercy of those processes and bureaucracy to come back with what the ultimate answer to those decisions are going to be. The purpose of this panel is just to explore a little bit some of the things that actually fall into more into our hands in terms of what if we had the political will, what are some of the choices that we could make. And so I want to welcome to you this afternoon our panel. And so working from closest to me, Dr. Monica Ferris from the University of New Orleans, Center for Hazards Assessment, Response and Technology. We call it CHART. Thank you, Dr. Ferris, for being here. And then next to her, seated next to her, is Mr. Michael Witch, he is the Director of Building Code Administration and the Chief Building Official for the South Central Planning and Development Commission in Houma. And then on the other side of him is Mr. Mark Lujan, who is our go-to person in Louisiana for flood insurance. He's a flood insurance senior regional insurance specialist for FEMA Region 6. And then lastly on the end is Miss Julia Fisher-Perrier, who in addition to being a councilwoman for St. Charles Parish Government, is also an insurance agent and also serves on the Louisiana Police Jury. So we'll get right to it. So I'm going to begin, if I could, with Mr. Witch. And the first question is, you serve as the Chief Building Official for South Central Planning and Development District. What do you see as the benefits and challenges for approaching building codes at a regional level?
Yes. Is it on? You can hear? Okay. At South Central Planning, we do have a regional building code program that covers 6 parishes and 5 towns. And I would say the biggest challenge associated with that really is from the political side, trying to get parish presidents and mayors and councils and police juries all on the same page to work together for the same end result. After Katrina, the state passed the statewide building code. Many areas of the state had no building code enforcement prior to that. This group got together to form a program that would not only save them money by the economy of scale, but also take a regional approach to enforcement. Because as we talked earlier about water and so forth, but water doesn't know where parish lines are and so forth. Neither do developers and contractors. They follow opportunities. And so the region felt as though this would be a real good opportunity for contractors and so forth to know what they have to expect from a building code perspective, no matter where they were building in the region. So that was a tremendous advantage to the builders. It was also able to provide those services to them at a much lower cost than having to go to each individual jurisdiction to do that. And but the challenge comes in that every location, every jurisdiction, every parish, every town has different needs. It's trying to work together to come up with a process and a program that meets all of those needs and gets us to the same end result. And I can tell you, it can be done. It's worked out very well in our region. We're as efficient as it gets as far as how we respond to permit applications, and our enforcement is extremely consistent. Part of being resilient is actually good enforcement. So we do have that, and I think it's something that for many areas, a regional approach would be extremely beneficial, but it does take a strong political will to get that done.
Thank you. So there's an example of communities that have decided together to approach something like building codes from a regional perspective, and we'll revisit maybe that in just a second. The next question is for Ms. Fisher-Perrier. As an insurance agent and as a parish elected official, what would you say is the unique importance of the National Flood Insurance Program for Louisiana?
National Flood Insurance Program is extremely important to Louisiana. Can you guys hear me? Okay. And this region, especially as of late, should realize that there's no such thing as a non-required flood zone, a non-flood zone in Louisiana. There is a non-required flood zone, but everywhere in Louisiana has water. So everyone in Louisiana is in some sort of flood zone. Therefore, this commonly misused term often confuses residents into thinking that they should not have flood insurance. I don't think there's any reason in Louisiana that anyone should not have flood insurance. Everyone should have flood insurance of some sort. If you're in a non-required flood zone, of course, in layman's terms, that means you're only going to pay about $450 for maximum coverage on a residential structure. There's no reason not to protect your, probably one of your biggest investments in your life when we see what can happen. We think that we're not going to flood, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. These recent floods here have forced a lot of folks in these non-required zones to accept some sort of disaster relief. And I think, through discussions with some of the other parish local elected officials, these residents don't realize now that they're going to be forced to have flood insurance if they did accept some sort of disaster assistance. So now's the time. It protects our investment, which is, simply what it is. It's transfer of risk. That's what insurance is. You're moving risk from one place to another. And with the amount of water that we have in Louisiana, there's just no reason. So my suggestion, take advantage of the National Flood Insurance Program while it is available. It's your largest investment. So.
Thank you. Mr. Lujan, so let's stay on flood insurance for just a second. So we've talked about some of this prior, but as communities consider, and maybe some of them have already adopted or might consider adopting higher standards, such as a freeboard requirement. Shona and the team mentioned that before, and for those of you that may not be familiar with that, that's just an additional height above the base flood elevation that the community would require that as the minimum standard for their area. So in something like a freeboard requirement for a community, what would be the insurance rate benefits to the policyholder?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks, and thank you, Casey. So this is very important, and where I'm going to go back to is what we have heard from today. We heard the governor this morning, or this afternoon, talk about wanting to keep insurance affordable. I think that is very important. We also cannot forget the slide, I hope everyone is paying attention to that, of the slide that Shona and Steve gave on the amount of structures that were inundated with less than 1 foot of freeboard. That is substantial. That the importance of freeboard and having these higher standards within their community's floodplain ordinance is critical. So when we're along those same lines, when we look at how to keep that affordable, what does that mean for property owners that live in a community with those higher standards? There are substantial savings. Remember the NFIP, what's its number one goal? What was it created for? Protect life and property, right? That's what it was created for. That's how you do it as freeboard. So let me give you just an example, okay? These are approximate, just to give you an example here. In an AE zone, your special flood hazard area, if somebody had $200,000 for building coverage and $80,000 worth of contents, if you are built at the base flood elevation, which are FEMA's minimum requirements, you're approximately paying about $2,000 per year off current rates. Okay? If you are 1 foot, means that your lowest floor was built 1 foot above that base flood elevation, that brings it down to just about $1,000 per year. 2 feet above, about $700. Okay, so you can see that savings that's going to be occurring. Not only that, but you're remaining safer than what that is. So there are significant impacts to having a freeboard requirement, and we see there are various communities within Louisiana that have adopted that and continue to look at these higher standards.
Thank you. Finally, we're going to, Dr. Ferris, move to maybe how some of these things intersect. So as communities consider these higher standards and other strategies, including projects to reduce the flood risk, what's the community rating system and how do communities participate in that?
Can you hear me? Is this better? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So the community rating system is a voluntary program that encourages communities to take on floodplain management activities that go above and beyond what is required of them under the National Flood Insurance Program. How does the CRS encourage? Well, they provide incentives, which are discounts on flood insurance premiums that range from 5% to 45%, depending on the community's classification. The goals of the CRS, thank you, are to reduce and avoid flood damage to insurable properties, strengthen and support in the insurance aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program, and to support comprehensive floodplain management. There are 4 categories of credible activities that support the goals of the CRS and that communities can earn points. These include public information activities, mapping and regulations, such as enforcing higher regulatory standards, as we just mentioned, flood damage reduction activities, and warning and response. Of the 314 National Flood Insurance Program communities currently in Louisiana, 42 participate in the CRS, which is just 13%. There are local CRS resources for communities who are interested in joining the program or just learning more about it. Pam Lightfoot in Cindy O'Neill's office, Cindy's right there. Pam Lightfoot is the state CRS coordinator, and I'm sure she would be glad to answer any questions you might have or help you get started in the application process, because you do have to apply to participate. There's also CRS users groups across South Louisiana. There are 4 of them that would be glad, they meet regularly and would be glad to have new participants join in our conversation about how we can better implement the CRS throughout our state. And UNO Chart actually is working with the state and local communities to develop a CRS strategy for the entire state. It will serve as an appendix to the hazard mitigation plan. And one of those goals, or one of our goals for that strategy, is to have a list of resources for local communities so that they can go to know who to go to get the type of data and just technical assistance they might need in implementing CRS activities. Thank you.
Thank you. So the quick note on that is, we are missing as a state opportunities to lower the rates for our citizens by not participating in the community rating system, by not adopting some of the higher standards. And so not only do we get the benefits of reducing risk, and so reducing the likelihood of flooding in the future, reducing the extent of flooding in the future, we also are missing some of the financial benefits of not having the amount of coverage that we need as a state and the cost of that coverage. So just maybe a couple of last points on flood insurance. Ms. Fisher-Perrier, the existing authorization for NFIP is about to come up. Reauthorization's a hot topic these days. What are your thoughts on improvements to be considered in the reauthorization?
I think two key words that everyone has really honed in on when it comes to the reauthorization of the program are sustainable and affordable. I think you all have heard it a few times today, but that's what we really need to drive home. Back in 2012, we saw some legislation called Biggert Waters come through and really cause some unintended consequences. We in St. Charles Parish, we're looking at some $30,000 flood insurance premiums. So we all know that a $150,000 home or household cannot afford $30,000 just for an annual flood insurance premium. So federal government took a step back and made some changes. So it's got to be sustainable, it's got to be affordable. We also hope to maybe get it renewed for longer this time. 10 years would be great if it can look the way we want it to look. We have seen the program lapse in the past, and just as economic development mentioned that a disaster or some sort of rain event can cause a stagnant business economic development situation, a lapse in flood insurance program can also cause a stagnant or put to a complete halt your housing market. So if you don't have flood insurance available, your properties can't continue to move. They don't turn over. So we don't want to see that happen. We want to make sure that our federal legislators know that we need this to be renewed in September, and it needs to have the information in it, the bullet points that look favorable to the majority, not just Louisiana necessarily, but the majority of the country. The program needs to take into account that accurate data maybe needs to be considered this go round. As John Bell Edwards spoke earlier on base flood elevation, science has come a long way since this portion of the program has really been updated. So we need to enforce that updated scientific data is taken into consideration when those base flood elevations are calculated. The program needs relief from debt, which I think we're all aware of. So, of course, the more people that purchase it, the less debt it's going to have, but that's all the more reason why it needs to be affordable. So, privatization is looking very likely when it comes to what the program's going to look like. It's not necessarily going to happen 100% right out of the gate, but I think that the federal side is going to be paired with some strict rules on the privatized side. So that would be a possibility to how we can make it more affordable and hopefully get more folks to buy into the program. Then lots of other details within the program itself. I think we have 5 bills out there right now. Some look similar, some do not, but grandfather clause, that's one thing that I think everybody's in agreement that should stay in. If you followed the code at the time, you shouldn't be penalized too hard. So it's hard to go back on somebody there, but a lot of little technical details as far as what the program should look like. So the gist of what it should be is just really a common sense approach. They've sought, the federal government sought this perspective of local government. In the last few years since the Biggert Water things happened, they've looked to us for what we saw on a local level and taken a step back. So we need to continue to communicate. Everyone should reach out to their legislators on a federal level and let them know what they think and what they see and what their flood insurance declaration page looks like. They need real life examples of what's going on, because I think that was the biggest problem. We just had a lapse in communication. And just in closing, flood insurance is something that I feel protects property, just as Mark said here. But real protection from floodwaters are levees and pumps and having a plan. So if all of the state could get to a point of complete protection, we'd be protected not only from flood waters, but also flood insurance rates. So I commend this group for getting together and trying to be forward-moving and self-sufficient, and as the governor said, resilient. If everyone had a plan and everyone was truly protected, we wouldn't even really have to discuss the National Flood Insurance Program. So, good job to all of you.
Thank you. Mr. Lujan, so it came up earlier in the floods of 2016. I think for all of us, a shocking number of those structures that flooded were not in areas identified as a special flood hazard area, not in areas where there would be a mortgage requirement to purchase flood insurance. And perhaps, you know, as we spoke about it earlier, the terminology, I'm in a flood zone or I'm out of a flood zone, people thinking that, well, if I don't have to buy it, then either I can't buy it or I shouldn't buy it, or I'm not in a flood zone, so why would I buy it? And then we have flooding like we had in 2016, where we realized that 20 inches of rain in any location, 30 inches of rain in any location, it doesn't matter what the zone designation is, you've got a good chance of flooding. So what can communities do to address those parts of their community where there may not be, in today's language, a requirement for them to regulate? What can they do in those areas we would call an X zone? And what's the flood insurance impacts of doing those types of things?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I'll tell you, this is something I hold dear to my heart, is these X zones, these outside of the special flood hazard area. So many times in my day job, what I get is so many people calling in saying, what can I do now? What do? I did not have a federal requirement to carry that flood insurance policy, so I didn't have it. So I was caught in these March and these August floods, and I'm out on my own. I have to rely on friends. I have to rely on families, my churches, things to put me back. And just as Julia said, the importance of what we call a preferred risk policy. Okay, this low to moderate risk floodplain, where you can get that coverage, just as Julia said, for about $450 per year for maximum coverage. But how do you get that message out? It's about showing what that true risk is. And I think everyone in this room, we can all work together, just like we're doing here, to show what that true risk is. Also, talking about higher standards, going back to that, is communities can adopt higher standards where they enforce floodplain management regulations outside of that special flood hazard area. Okay? That's really important, and I'll give you one good reason why. Is they are looking to how these structures are being built. Okay, so we don't have a base flood elevation, things like that in the X zone, but they look at various factors, such as making sure your lowest floor is built 1 or 2 feet above the center line of the street, or 1 or 2 feet above the closest base flood elevation in that nearest special flood hazard area. What's a crucial part of that, though, is if you have that in your ordinance, those homeowners that have that flood insurance policy in that X zone, even that preferred risk policy, they're eligible to collect for increased cost of compliance. And that is a huge factor. Where normally ICC, or increased cost of compliance, where you may be able to get up to an additional $30,000 to help mitigate your structure, that's only available when you're in the special flood hazard area. But if your community adopts and enforces floodplain management regs, and it's located and it's in your ordinance, those homeowners that have that policy are eligible for that as well. So those are things that we can do, of getting that message out and looking at what happens. And painting that true risk is talking to these homeowners, having them come out and say, what was it like for you not having a flood insurance policy and you sustained this damage? What happened? Well, you can possibly, in a presidentially declared disasters, look at the Small Business Administration for a loan. There's disaster assistance available, very limited disaster assistance. So ultimately, it's going to be another burden on yourself to recover from these events. And this is the message as far as painting risk showing what that true risk, this is what it's all about. And I think we can all be in agreement on that point that, that these slowly more people are seeing what it truly takes to recover from one of these events.
Dr. Ferris, in addition to maybe some of these, what are some other best practices that you've seen communities adopt that ultimately provide higher protection, but also provide some savings to their flood insurance policies through CRS?
Sure. So I'm not sure which one I'm actually using. So when we're talking about points and savings specifically, the most points can be garnered through activities such as preserving open space, which we've discussed a little bit today, acquisition and relocation of properties, and enforcing higher regulatory standards, not only freeboard, but things like prohibiting fill, low impact development policies, and we could go on about those. It's a very prescriptive program. It's guided by a manual that's over 600 pages long. So if you're interested in looking it up, you can find it online and find exact examples. But the good news is that there are also significant points to be garnered in many of the activities communities do already and maybe aren't documenting them the way CRS wants you to document them, or implementing them in a way, the exact way CRS would like you to. Outreach is one of those activities. The CRS users groups that I mentioned, two of the ones that we work with now have developed or recently developed programs for public information, or PPIs, which are formal strategies developed to guide outreach efforts. And the projects within these strategies will garner bonus points within the CRS system. The groups are also working on flood response preparations. Again, formalizing steps they already take or already have in motion often regarding education and outreach when floods occur or when floods are pending, when we know a storm is coming. A community's hazard mitigation plan can earn hundreds of points, over 300 points, which is quite significant within the CRS, if they're developed according to CRS guidelines, so documented and having those specific steps taken. And of course, the data that Shona Gibson showed us earlier, the whole time I was thinking, wow, this is great, and the communities can get CRS points for these. Let's work together to figure that out and how they can access that to use to their advantage in many ways, including the CRS. And I think really the key to expanding the CRS and to increasing activities within the CRS is really education about the program itself, and also providing support to community CRS coordinators who often wear many hats. They're the floodplain manager, the building inspector, many hats, especially in these smaller communities. So they need the time, the resources, and attention so that they can implement and coordinate these activities to earn points for their communities, but most importantly, to help reduce risk. Thank you.
And then finally, Mr. Witch, I wanted to end with this. I understand that your region has already had some conversations in the past about a regional approach to drainage standards. So I just thought maybe we would end with, from your experience, what are some of the benefits and challenges that have occurred out of that discussion?
Well, there've been some very high-level discussions, just kind of throwing that idea out there, because as we talked about earlier, communities can sometimes dump water on one another, and it just seems to make sense to take a more comprehensive approach from a regional standpoint when looking at drainage issues when it concerns development, whether it's development of subdivisions or businesses and so forth. So if you can take a more regional approach and standardize that approach and take into account the entire region, instead of just getting the water out of where you are and putting it on someone else, at the end of the day, it'll likely result in a cost savings for many of the developers, but also result in much better drainage situation throughout your entire region. So it just seems to make sense. I know the presentation earlier actually hit on some of those ideas, so it's just sort of reinforcing some of those high-level conversations that have taken place so far. It's exciting to see that other parts of the state are also considering some of these things, because I think, as usual, once one or two places do it, it tends to catch on, especially if it's working well. And just a more regional approach, and instead of worrying about just yourself and just your immediate vicinity, I think we'll see economic development growth throughout the entire region if we can solve these problems as a region.
Thank you. Join me in thanking the panel. So I'm gonna wrap up our time by just pulling back together a few ideas. So the goal of that panel discussion was to have some dialogue about some of the decisions that do fall under your court, some of the decisions that do fall within your jurisdiction and within the power that you have in your communities. And to say that should you make some of those decisions, there are potentially some savings relative to flood insurance that can follow. And so to encourage you to consider that. Obviously, no one is going to come out and say that all of these decisions would be popular everywhere, or that maybe all of them are the best fit for everywhere. But as we walk through this process, the goal is that we would be considering these things and we would be thinking about these things, and not just dismissing them out of hand. Because the reality is we'll never have enough money to do all of the projects that everybody could identify in every part of the state that would give us the level of protection that we might need or that we might want. And even if we did, what would be the disruption that would come from that, and what would be the economic impacts of that? And it will never dig our way or protect our way out of all of this risk. And so on the other hand, there are things outside of projects that we should all consider, that we should all think about, and some of those we've talked about with this panel. And in addition, we need to ensure that we don't look at flood insurance as a South Louisiana thing or a coastal thing. If March taught us anything, it's that flooding can and will occur anywhere, and we're all at risk. And despite all of our best efforts, some of that risk will remain, and we need to look at things like flood insurance as a way to better protect both your investments at a local level as well as your constituents. And I will share Mark's comments. I can't tell you how many community meetings that I attended after March and or August where I'm talking face to face with someone that's just lost everything, and their comment to me was, but they told me I couldn't buy flood insurance, or they told me somebody somewhere told them they didn't need it, or that's how they heard it. And there were so many mixed signals about the fact that flood insurance is only for people in these areas, and if you live outside of that, then you don't need it. And so we've got to do a better job of communicating and understanding that there are levels of risk, but we're all at risk. And so that's something that I think we need to focus on. And then as we walk through this pilot and as we walk through some of these regional approaches, we need to be thinking not just about the things that we can go get some grant funding to do, but what are some best practices that we could put in place to better protect our citizens. And so I want to reiterate just a few things as we close. In terms of the watershed study, that data is going to be available for everybody, and those watersheds that are covered crisscross the state and the impacted areas. So I want to make perfectly clear that that information will be available, and you should access it, and we will be looking forward to continued dialogue about that. As it relates to the Louisiana Resilience Recovery pilot program, again, we're focusing on 3 watersheds starting here in Vermilion. Those discussions have already started, and we got a big event in just a little while to focus on that some more. And then this fall we'll be in Lower Ouachita and Beth. Significant flooding in March in that watershed and in that part of the state that may have had some localized flooding issues in the past, but a catastrophic flood across a large swath of that community. And then obviously the most impacted watershed, the Amite River watershed, will be starting this work in early 2018. There's already a lot of dialogue, a lot of coordination, and a lot of ideas about that we're going to hope to be able to engage and build on. And just hearkening back really quickly to what the governor said, our 4 areas of focus. 1, developing a regional approach to decision making, that we can no longer just stay within our silos and just stay within our own boundaries, and think that we're going to make significant strides as it relates to reducing flood risk. We've got to talk to our neighbors, we've got to work with our neighbors, and we've got to coordinate with our neighbors. Perhaps easier said than done, but we see the consequences if we don't. And then segueing to number 2, developing and maintaining strategic partnerships. These partnerships are represented in this room this afternoon. Not just government and not just governmental agencies, but private sector, our universities and academia, our nonprofits and civic organizations, and then just the ordinary citizens that live in your communities that know where the flooding occurs and know where the problems are and know the things that are not working and the things that are. We need to engage and develop all of those partnerships. And then 3, developing a holistic approach to future flood risk. The purpose of this panel was to engage in some of that. But outside of just other regulations and higher standards, we're going to talk a little bit more in the Vermilion watershed about other things that you can do to help live with and around water besides just trying to protect ourselves from it, and making wiser decisions and understanding things like green infrastructure and permeable surfaces and how small changes like that can be added together from community to community and create a cumulative effect that can make a big difference. And then the information piece of this. We've got lots of places where good information already exists. And we've got lots of people with ideas on how to go get better information. We also have people that understand, hey, when they did that thing back in 1953 or when they made that change in 1987, some of it worked, but some of it didn't work. And so we don't need to just go recreate the wheel. We need to build on some of the experiences of the past and understand from both our successes and our mistakes how we better move forward. So as I began this afternoon with, I wasn't really sure sometimes what all of this means and what all of it is. At the end of the day, it's developing a framework and the partnerships to keep this work moving and to go from these communities that we will start with to the rest of our state. It won't be a carbon copy program that just gets, sent through the copy machine and then sent off to the next watershed. They're all different. If you were to talk to Tangipahoa, probably his biggest neighbor that he needs to work with is Mississippi, not St. Tammany or Livingston Parish, for example. And so, who are those partners, and how do we get those partners to the table? And how do we maintain these things and move forward? So, I want to just end today with a few words of thanks. Obviously, I want to thank FEMA for working with us to make today possible and tonight possible, and the work that we're going to do in the days and weeks to come in Vermilion and then in the lower Ouachita-Beff area and Amite in the days and months to come. I want to thank them for the watershed study and the collaboration and the good ideas that came out of that. That was not an idea that sat on the shelf that one day we went and said, hey, let's execute that program. It was people thinking outside the box to say, how can we help, and coming up with what those ideas look like. So I want to say thank you again to FEMA for that. I want to thank you for participating. I want to thank you for jumping into an event that didn't probably make a whole lot of sense on the front end and may not make a lot of sense yet, but that's our goal, is to get there. Thank you for connecting, and we look forward to you sticking around for the networking period later to talk to your neighbors and talk to others that you may have heard from today that may have some good ideas to help us put these things into plans and ultimately put them into action. I want to say just a quick word of thanks to our event sponsors today, the Louisiana Economic Development. Thank you to them for making today possible. The Lafayette Economic Development Authority, thanks to them for helping make today possible, as well as One Acadiana for helping make today possible. Also, thank to the University of Louisiana at Lafayette for helping host in this wonderful building. I've heard from some of you that are like, hey, if out of anything today, what I want is the plans and the money to go build one of these in my neighborhood. I think I heard that somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't think Hazard Mitigation Grant Program dollars will build you one of these, but it's a beautiful venue nonetheless. And then a couple of just last reminders. In each of your packets, you should have a yellow. I think I've been told the technical term is goldenrod. Evaluation sheet. The most important thing that you can contribute today is that sheet back to us to help us to know who the partners are, where the ideas are, what part of this makes sense, what part of this doesn't make sense, so that as we may be moving to your area in the near future, that can help guide our efforts. So I want to remind you to please fill that out. And then finally, we're going to end here in just a moment, and there's an opportunity back in the atrium in the opening to stick around for the networking time and to continue the dialogue with those around you. And then those of you that may have found a green sticker on your name tag, that's not an inventory sticker, that is an indication that you are supposed to stick around for the evening session as we focus on the Vermilion watershed specifically. So again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to FEMA and all of their help. And thank you to you for coming today. Much appreciated. Yes, sir. Okay.
Come on, Ron.
How do they help? Most residents don't know about the evaluation,
Elevation.
elevation certificates.
An elevation certificate is not necessary, of course, in a non-required flood zone, so an X zone, a B zone, a C zone. If they're in a required zone, they should have one on file. Depending on the situation, Monica's chomping at the bit. I might want to let Monica answer this one, but
I'm not a local official.
depending on the situation, it could help if you get an updated elevation certificate, or if there's not one on file in an A99 zone, perhaps, depending on the situation.
Well, I know
But-
some people can't afford them. Some people haven't had them,
correct.
and they get charged, ridiculous amount of insurance
My
premium for a year.
suggestion is that each individual that has a question as to whether or not an elevation certificate would or would not help, they need to call their agent before they pay that $250 for an elevation certificate. But it's an option, and it could help, but like I said, before they shell it out, speak with that agent, see if they can run a hypothetical quote, so.
You think as a parish we should like set a preference, like put an ordinance in place or put something in place to require insurance companies or stuff to let those people know about the elevation certificate and reduce their costs, something like that? Is that
It could come from the parish side. FEMA's been doing a
FEMA,
good job
yeah, well,
lately
maybe
of
FEMA, yeah,
communicating
FEMA.
with the agents, and the agents therefore should be getting the word out to their individual clients.
So I know some people in my parish don't have it.
Well, those agents, the agents are the key. They're the
Right.
ones that are the go-between.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just quickly say it takes all of us.
Sure.
There's a role for all of us to play as it relates to better education. There's no worse time to figure out flood insurance than after you flooded.
That's right.
The time to learn about flood insurance is before, and that falls on all of us to help create those opportunities to be better educated. FEMA's been very aggressive with webinars and so forth to get that information out, and we need to continue to make sure that it gets out to the right partners. With that, thanks for the question. Any additional questions before we go? All right, thanks to you all for coming today. Much appreciated.